The barbershop was quiet that morning, almost unnervingly so. The faint hum of the clippers blended with the muffled sounds of Manhattan beyond the glass door, car horns, distant chatter, the faint hiss of a bus pulling up outside. Inside, the air smelled faintly of talcum powder and shaving cream, the kind of clean, familiar scent that usually put men at ease. But not today. Today, a man sat in a chair who had made a lifetime out of putting others on edge. His name was Albert Anastasia, and though his frame looked relaxed under the white barber's cape, his reputation was anything but. He was called many things: the Lord High Executioner, the Mad Hatter of Murder, one of the most feared men ever to walk the streets of New York. His rise through the criminal underworld had been built on blood, and it would end in blood too, right here, in this chair. Imagine the sound of scissors clipping through hair, slow and rhythmic, a strangely calming sound against the storm that was about to break. The barber worked carefully, almost reverently, as though he knew the importance of his customer. Anastasia sat with his eyes closed, perhaps thinking of business, perhaps thinking of nothing at all. This was his sanctuary, the place where he let his guard down, and that was exactly why his enemies had chosen it. Out on the street, two men were preparing to walk through the door, guns hidden beneath their coats, hearts pounding with the weight of the job ahead. It was October 25, 1957, and in just a few minutes, Albert Anastasia would be dead. The story of how he came to be in that chair is one of the most compelling tales in all of organized crime history. To understand it, you have to picture the world he came from, the hard streets of Brooklyn, the bustling docks where longshoremen sweated under the watchful eye of mob bosses, and the secret meetings held in back rooms where the future of the American underworld was decided. Anastasia's life was a study in contrasts, calm yet violent, charming yet terrifying, a man who could smile warmly at a friend and then order a killing without blinking. He was not just a gangster, he was a symbol of a certain kind of power, one that ruled with fear more than words. This story isn't about glorifying the violence or sensationalizing crime. It's about tracing the arc of a man who embodied an era, a time when the Mafia was reorganizing itself into a national syndicate, when the old-world traditions of Sicily collided with the ruthless capitalism of America. Anastasia stood at the crossroads of that transformation. He was an immigrant who became a kingmaker, a dockworker who became a boss, and finally, a boss who became a target. The barbershop would be the setting of his final chapter, but his life was filled with moments just as dramatic, just as shocking, and just as human. Think of this as a story told by a calm narrator late at night, meant to lull you into a kind of waking dream. Picture the darkened streets of New York in the 1930s and 40s, the glow of street lamps reflecting on wet pavement, the silhouettes of men in fedoras leaning against parked cars. Imagine the quiet knock on a door, the low voices inside, the sudden silence when something serious was about to be discussed. That was Anastasia's world, a world where every handshake could be an alliance or a death sentence, where loyalty was everything until it wasn't. As we move through this journey together, we'll follow Albert Anastasia from his earliest days, when he stepped off a boat as a teenage immigrant from Calabria, to his violent beginnings on the docks, to his role in the notorious Murder Incorporated killing machine, and finally to his rise as boss of one of the most powerful crime families in America. Along the way, we'll see the decisions that shaped him, the enemies that haunted him, and the paranoia that eventually consumed him. Each moment brings us closer to that barbershop, closer to the stillness before the shots, closer to the image of a man caught in the very trap he had set for so many others. The story of Anastasia's death has a strange, almost cinematic quality to it. The killers, masked with scarves, stepping forward silently, the startled barber freezing in place, the bullets ripping through the calm like thunderclaps. It is a scene that has been retold countless times in books, newspapers, and documentaries. But behind the headline, behind the myth, there was a man, not a hero, not quite a villain in the comic book sense, but a man of contradictions who lived by a code of power and paid the ultimate price for it. As you listen to this story, let yourself settle into the rhythm of the words. There will be violence, yes, but told in a way that feels distant, almost like a dream you are observing rather than living. The goal is not to shock but to understand, to see how one man's choices rippled out to change the shape of organized crime in America. Albert Anastasia's life is a reminder that no empire, no matter how fearsome, lasts forever. The barbershop chair is waiting at the end of every story like this, patient and inevitable. So close your eyes, take a slow breath, and imagine the faint buzz of the clippers again. Imagine the man sitting there, powerful but suddenly very human, as the footsteps approach from behind. This is where the story begins, in the quiet before the storm, in a barbershop frozen in time, with a man who was both executioner and victim. What happened next would shock even the underworld he helped build, and it would mark the beginning of a new era for the Mafia. Before Albert Anastasia was feared across the American underworld, before he was called the Lord High Executioner or the Mad Hatter, he was just Umberto Anastasio, a boy from Calabria. Imagine the sun-baked hills of southern Italy in the early 1900s, rugged, beautiful, but harsh. Life there was not gentle. Families worked the land, scraping together what little they could from the soil, their lives measured in seasons and harvests. Poverty was not just an inconvenience, it was a shadow that hung over every meal, every decision. Young Albert grew up in a world where survival meant toughness, and toughness meant you had to learn early not to back down. The local disputes were sometimes settled with fists, sometimes with knives, and Albert's temper was already legendary before he ever saw the shores of America. His family, like so many others, dreamed of something more than what Calabria could offer. The promise of America, the land of opportunity, called to them, even if they knew it would not be easy. Passage to the United States meant leaving everything behind, the narrow streets, the old family home, the graves of ancestors. When Albert was about 15, he boarded a ship bound for New York, carrying little more than determination and a name that would soon become feared. The Atlantic crossing was long, rough, and crowded. The ship's lower decks were filled with immigrants like him, clutching their belongings, coughing in the damp air, speaking in a dozen different dialects. You can almost picture him standing at the rail, staring at the endless gray sea, wondering what awaited him on the other side. When he arrived, the first sight of the Statue of Liberty must have been surreal, a towering figure promising freedom, dignity, and a new beginning. But reality greeted him not with opportunity, but with hardship. He was processed at Ellis Island, his name misspelled from Anastasio to Anastasia, a small clerical error that would stick with him for life. Soon he found himself in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood filled with other Italians trying to carve out a living. The streets were crowded, noisy, alive with the smells of bread baking and street vendors calling out their wares. But they were also dangerous. These were places where crime was woven into the fabric of daily life, where gangsters collected protection money and young boys learned quickly that you had to choose whether to be prey or predator. Albert chose predator. He was a big young man, physically strong from the start, and work came easy to him on the docks. The Brooklyn waterfront was the beating heart of the shipping industry, but it was also a place where mobsters ruled. Every crate that came off a ship, every shift that was worked, had a price. If you wanted steady work, you paid your dues, not to the shipping companies, but to the men who controlled the piers. Albert learned to navigate this world quickly. He kept his head down at first, doing the hardest jobs without complaint, but he was also learning who held the real power, who to talk to, and who to avoid. It didn't take long for his temper and strength to get him noticed. There are stories of him getting into fights, of standing up for himself when someone tried to cheat him out of his pay. He was not the kind of man to back away from confrontation. That reputation made him dangerous, but it also made him valuable to men higher up the chain, men who needed enforcers, men who needed someone who could be relied on to keep order on the docks. And in that world, keeping order sometimes meant breaking bones. At night, Albert walked the streets of Brooklyn, taking in the life of the neighborhood. The pushcart vendors packing up after a long day, the soft glow of gas lamps, the sound of laughter spilling from taverns where men gathered to drink away the fatigue of the day. But there was always another sound, too, the quiet conversations in alleyways, the sudden silence when something serious was being discussed. These were the places where his future was being shaped, even if he didn't know it yet. The transition from an ordinary dockworker to a feared figure was not overnight. It was a slow burn, a series of choices that pulled him deeper and deeper into the world of organized crime. Maybe it started with a favor: a man needed someone to intimidate a rival, or a load of cargo needed to go missing, without questions being asked. Albert proved himself useful. He was reliable, discreet, and most of all, unafraid. In the mafia world, fearlessness was a rare and valuable commodity. But there was also a darker undercurrent in his early years, an event that would nearly end his life before it truly began. In 1921, Albert Anastasia was arrested for murder, accused of killing a fellow dockworker during an argument. The details of that case are still debated, but what is clear is that he was convicted and sentenced to death. Imagine being so young and facing the electric chair, sitting in a cell at Sing Sing prison, the walls closing in around you. For most men, that would have been the end of the story. But Albert's story was just beginning. After serving about 18 months, he was granted a retrial, and in a stroke of incredible fortune, he was released. Whether it was due to lack of evidence, witness intimidation, or pure luck, we may never know, but it gave him a second chance at life, and he would use it to rise higher than anyone could have imagined. This brush with death hardened him, gave him a sense that fate itself was on his side. He walked out of prison a free man with a reputation that was already beginning to grow on the streets. People whispered about him, the man who had beaten the chair, the man who might be untouchable. As you picture him stepping back onto the streets of Brooklyn, think of the night air hitting his face, the distant sound of ships' horns on the river, the flicker of lights across the water. For Albert, this was no longer just survival. It was the beginning of something bigger. The docks were still waiting, the rackets were still there, but now he had a taste of what it meant to have destiny on his side. He would not waste that chance. The boy from Calabria was becoming something else, something darker, something more dangerous. And somewhere, quietly watching, were men who saw in him the potential to be more than just muscle. They saw a future enforcer, someone who could help them control the rackets, someone who could be trusted with bigger jobs. Albert Anastasia's journey into the heart of the mafia was about to truly begin. The streets of Brooklyn in the early 1920s were alive with opportunity for a young man who had just escaped death row. For Albert Anastasia, freedom felt different this time, sharper, more urgent, as if he had been given a second life and was determined not to waste it. The world of the docks was still his home, but now he carried a reputation. He was no longer just another worker, he was the man who had beaten the chair. Men whispered about him in corners, some in awe, some in fear. And in the underworld, whispers like that traveled fast. Albert's first steps back into that world were not quiet ones. Violence had followed him before, and it followed him now, but this time it was directed, purposeful. There were debts to collect, disputes to settle, and men who needed to be reminded who controlled the Brooklyn waterfront. Albert was willing to do what others hesitated to do, to get his hands dirty. He was big, physically imposing, with a stare that could freeze a man in place, and a temper that erupted without warning. But there was something more, a calmness that came after the storm. He could explode in a burst of violence and then sit down as though nothing had happened, lighting a cigarette with steady hands. This unnerving ability made him dangerous, and valuable. It was during this time that Albert began to catch the attention of bigger players. Organized crime in New York was beginning to change. The old Sicilian bosses still ran their neighborhoods like fiefdoms, but a younger generation, men like Charles, Lucky, Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky, were thinking bigger. They wanted to build something beyond the old feuds, a national syndicate that ran like a business. And to build it, they needed enforcers, men who could keep order, men who could make problems disappear. Albert fit that mold perfectly. He started with small jobs. A man who refused to pay his kickbacks might find his windows smashed or his ribs broken. A rival who threatened the wrong person might quietly vanish. Each act built his reputation further, until people knew that crossing the wrong boss meant a visit from Anastasia. He was learning the rules of the underworld: respect, loyalty, silence, and he followed them to the letter. This was how trust was built, and trust was the currency of the mob. The early 1930s were a time of blood in New York. The Castellamarese War had erupted, a vicious power struggle between Joe, the boss, Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Gangland killings were happening almost weekly. It was in this climate that Anastasia proved himself indispensable. He was said to have participated in hits ordered by Luciano's faction, helping tip the balance of power. Whether he personally pulled the trigger or simply organized the logistics, his reputation as a killer was solidifying. But what made him truly feared was not just the killings, it was the way he approached them. There were men who killed because they had to, who shook afterward, who drank to forget. Then there were men like Anastasia, who could kill without hesitation and go to dinner as though nothing had happened. This cold efficiency would later earn him the chilling title, Lord High Executioner. At the same time, Albert's charisma was drawing people to him. He had a way of speaking that could calm a room, a way of making allies feel like they were part of something bigger. Those who worked under him were fiercely loyal, not just because they feared him but because they respected him. He protected his own, as long as they obeyed. In a world where betrayal could mean death, that kind of loyalty made him a valuable asset to the rising Luciano organization. The waterfront rackets became his domain. Control of the docks meant control of everything that came through them: food, clothing, weapons, even narcotics. If you controlled the docks, you controlled the flow of money. And Albert was a master at control. He knew which foreman to bribe, which police officer to pay off, and which troublemaker to make disappear. It was a delicate balance of fear and favors, and Albert kept it balanced with brutal precision. But his rise was not without risk. Law enforcement was beginning to notice the young man who seemed to be everywhere trouble happened. There were more arrests, more investigations. Witnesses, however, had a curious habit of forgetting what they saw or deciding not to testify. Whether this was because of intimidation, bribery, or respect for the Mafia code of silence, omerta, is hard to say. But each time he walked free, his legend grew. There is a story told from this era about a man who dared to defy the mob's control of the docks. Albert reportedly confronted him personally, giving him a choice: cooperate or face the consequences. When the man refused, Albert made an example of him in a way so decisive that no one else tried to resist for years afterward. The message was clear: the docks belonged to Anastasia. His partnership with other enforcers was beginning to form, most notably with Louis Lepka Buckleter. Together, they would go on to oversee what the newspapers would later call Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate. But in these early days, it was just Albert proving that he was the man for the job, the man who would take on the dangerous work others shied away from. Evenings in Brooklyn during this period must have been tense, a mixture of celebration and fear. The speakeasies buzzed with music and laughter, but in the back rooms, quiet deals were struck. Albert moved easily through these worlds, the working class tough on the street and the trusted confidant of mob leaders behind closed doors. He was no longer just a boy from Calabria. He was becoming a key figure in a growing empire. As you picture him walking through the dimly lit streets at night, his hat pulled low, coat collar turned up against the chill, imagine the whispers that followed him. People would lower their voices when he passed, nod respectfully, and step aside. He was a man becoming more than a man, a figure of fear, a name that carried weight. And he was just getting started. The foundation had been laid. Albert Anastasia was no longer just a survivor of the docks or a lucky man who had escaped the chair. He was becoming a professional killer, a trusted enforcer, and soon, one of the architects of organized crime in America. The next phase of his life would take him into darker territory still, into the heart of the organization that would make him a legend, and ultimately, a target. The Brooklyn waterfront was a world unto itself, a sprawling kingdom of warehouses, cargo ships, and endless crates stacked like small mountains. It smelled of salt water, oil, and sweat, the air thick with the shouts of stevedores and the constant creak of ropes and pulleys. This was where Albert Anastasia truly began to carve out his empire. The docks were more than a workplace, they were a chessboard, and every pier was a square to be controlled. Whoever owned the docks owned the flow of goods into New York City, and by extension, they owned a piece of the city's beating heart. Albert's rise here was not subtle. He used a combination of fear and charm, knowing when to offer a handshake and when to make a threat. To the longshoreman, he could be both protector and tyrant. If you paid your dues and kept your mouth shut, you might find steady work and a little extra cash in your envelope at the end of the week. But if you crossed him, you risked disappearing into the dark waters of the East River. This delicate balance was something Albert understood intuitively. Power wasn't just about violence, it was about timing, about knowing when to act and when to wait. It was during this period that his name began circulating among some of the most powerful men in the underworld. Charles "Lucky" Luciano was building something unprecedented, a vision of organized crime as a business rather than a loose collection of feuding gangs. Luciano saw in Albert a man who could enforce that vision, a man who could keep order not just on the streets but across entire industries. And so began one of the most important alliances of Albert Anastasia's life. Luciano was charismatic, calculating, and forward-thinking. He was reorganizing the old Sicilian mafia families into what would become known as the Commission, a governing body designed to prevent the kind of bloody gang wars that had nearly torn New York apart. To make that system work, he needed enforcers who would carry out decisions without hesitation, ensuring that no one could challenge the new order without paying the ultimate price. Albert was perfectly suited for this role. The partnership was mutually beneficial. For Luciano, Albert became a key figure in keeping labor rackets under control. The docks were crucial to the syndicate's income. Extortion, hijacking, and skimming profits from shipping companies brought in millions. With Anastasia at the helm, those operations ran smoothly. For Albert, Luciano's protection meant that his power could expand beyond Brooklyn. He was no longer just a local strongman, he was becoming part of a national network of crime, a man whose reputation extended far beyond the waterfront. Albert's methods were brutally efficient. He ensured that union bosses stayed loyal, often with a mix of bribes and threats. He could sit in a smoky backroom with a shipping executive, speaking in a calm, almost reassuring voice, and by the end of the meeting, the executive would understand that paying protection money was the only sensible option. If persuasion failed, Albert had other ways to make his point: a beating in a dark alley, a mysterious fire at the warehouse, a body found floating near the pier. These acts were not random, they were carefully chosen messages to keep everyone in line. The waterfront became a kingdom where Albert's word was law. He had lieutenants and soldiers to enforce his will, men who were fiercely loyal because he rewarded them well and punished them swiftly if they faltered. Each day brought new opportunities for profit: a shipment of silk that could be quietly diverted and sold, a crate of liquor that never made it onto the books, a strike that could be broken or encouraged depending on what benefited the family most. The money poured in, and Albert's influence grew. Beyond the docks, Luciano began using Anastasia for other, more delicate matters. There were disputes to settle, rivals to eliminate, and traitors to silence. Each job Albert took on was like another rung on the ladder, bringing him closer to the top of the underworld hierarchy. And with each job, his reputation for reliability grew. The other bosses knew that if Luciano sent Anastasia, the problem would be handled quickly and permanently. But with this rise in power came a growing darkness. Albert's temper, already notorious, became more dangerous now that he had the means to act on it. There are stories of him flying into a rage over minor insults, of him personally beating men who crossed him. These explosions of violence were terrifying to witness, but they also reinforced his image as someone not to be trifled with. Even those who feared him couldn't help but respect him. In the underworld, fear and respect were often two sides of the same coin. As the 1930s wore on, Luciano's new order took shape, and Albert was at its center. The old bosses who had resisted this reorganization were eliminated one by one, some gunned down in restaurants, others lured into quiet meetings from which they never returned. Albert was reportedly involved in several of these key hits, including the elimination of Salvatore Maranzano, the man who had briefly crowned himself boss of bosses. With Maranzano gone, Luciano and his allies cemented their control, and Albert's position was more secure than ever. The docks, meanwhile, became a reliable source of wealth not just for Albert but for the entire syndicate. He was now a power broker, a man who could make or break careers with a word. Politicians, police captains, and union leaders all knew his name, and many were on his payroll. Yet despite all this power, he remained, at his core, a man of action. He was not content to sit back and let others do the dirty work. When necessary, he still handled matters personally, reminding everyone that he was not just a boss but an enforcer, perhaps the most feared enforcer of his time. At night, as he looked out over the harbor, the lights of ships reflecting on the black water, Albert must have felt invincible. He had survived a death sentence, clawed his way up from the bottom, and now stood near the top of the criminal world. But power in the Mafia was always fragile, always contested. For now, the docks were his, and Luciano's trust was his shield. But there were others watching, others waiting, and Albert's story was far from finished. The next chapter would plunge him even deeper into the machinery of death, a machinery he would soon help run. By the late 1930s, Albert Anastasia had become more than just a powerful figure on the docks. He had become the man you called when someone needed to disappear, quietly, efficiently, and permanently. But what he was about to help build went far beyond local vendettas or dockside disputes. It was something entirely new in the history of organized crime, a systematized, nationwide enforcement arm for the American Mafia. The newspapers would one day call it Murder Incorporated, but to the men who ran it, it was simply business. Picture Brooklyn's Brownsville neighborhood, where this operation had its unofficial headquarters: narrow streets, dimly lit storefronts, and the ever-present smell of cigar smoke wafting from the backrooms where decisions were made. This was where Albert's partnership with Louis Lepka Buckleter, a cunning Jewish mobster, truly came to life. Together, they oversaw a hand-picked group of killers, perhaps 50 or 60 men at their peak, all trained to carry out contract killings with a chilling professionalism. This was no ragtag band of thugs. Murder Incorporated was organized, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient. It was the enforcement wing of the newly formed National Crime Syndicate, a loose confederation of Italian and Jewish gangsters led by figures like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello. When the syndicate decided that someone had to go, a rival boss, a rogue gambler, a stool pigeon who had turned informant, the order went down the chain and eventually landed on Albert's desk. His job was not to ask questions, not to weigh morality, but to ensure that the hit was carried out flawlessly. The killers under him were specialists. Men like Harry, Pittsburgh Phil, Strauss and Abe, Kid Twist, Relis became infamous for their creativity and brutality. Each hit was different, some victims were shot, others strangled, some stabbed or bludgeoned, depending on the message that needed to be sent. The choice of method was deliberate, almost ritualistic. If the syndicate wanted a clean message, a quiet removal, the death might look like an accident. If they wanted to make an example, the killing might be spectacular, a public warning that no one would dare ignore. Albert, for his part, was the overseer. He rarely pulled the trigger himself at this stage. Instead, he coordinated the assignments, approved the targets, and made sure there were no mistakes. He was known for his meticulous attention to detail, making sure the killers had alibis, making sure weapons were disposed of, making sure the police never had enough evidence to make charges stick. Under his watch, it is believed that Murder Incorporated was responsible for hundreds of killings, perhaps as many as 700 over a decade. There was a strange calm to the way Albert handled this work. To him, it was not personal, at least not usually. It was part of maintaining order, part of keeping the syndicate running smoothly. The organization could not afford renegades, and it could not afford to look weak. If someone threatened the stability of the business, they had to be removed. In this way, Albert became both judge and executioner, the man who decided when a life had reached its end in the eyes of the underworld. The press eventually caught wind of the operation. The term "Murder Incorporated" was coined by journalists eager to capture the public's imagination, and soon Albert's name was appearing in headlines alongside sensational accounts of contract killings. Yet for years, prosecutors were frustrated. Witnesses refused to testify, evidence vanished, and juries were too frightened to convict. It seemed as though Anastasia and his crew were untouchable, operating in the shadows while law enforcement scrambled to catch up. Still, the existence of Murder Incorporated became an open secret, both feared and weirdly respected. In some ways, it brought a form of order to the chaotic underworld. Gang wars that once left bodies piled in the streets became rare. Disputes were now settled by quiet, surgical removals rather than all-out battles. If you were a member of the syndicate, this was good for business. If you were an outsider who crossed them, it was a death sentence. Albert's role in this machinery earned him his most chilling nickname, the Lord High Executioner. The title was both fearsome and strangely formal, as if to suggest that he presided over a court where verdicts were final and appeal was impossible. It was also during these years that another nickname began to stick, the Mad Hatter, a reference to his sudden bursts of temper, his unpredictability, and the way he could go from calm to violent in an instant. Men who worked with him knew to tread carefully. His approval could mean wealth and protection, his anger could mean the end of everything. And yet, despite the violence, there was a quiet discipline to the way Anastasia ran things. He was not a man who killed for sport. Each hit had a purpose, each target had earned their fate by betraying the code, skimming from the wrong racket, or threatening the delicate balance of power. In his mind, this was business, harsh, brutal business, but business nonetheless. Imagine the scene late at night, when Albert would sit in a smoky room with his lieutenants, listening as they reported on jobs completed, problems resolved, names crossed off a list. Outside, the city kept moving, streetcars clattering past, nightclubs full of laughter, radios playing the music of the era, but in those back rooms, life and death were being decided with the stroke of a pen and the nod of a head. For the ordinary citizen, this world remained invisible, something read about in the papers but rarely seen up close. For those inside it, it was a reality they could not escape. Albert Anastasia was both feared and respected as the man who kept that reality running smoothly. And as the 1940s approached, his power was only growing. Murder Incorporated had made him indispensable to Luciano's syndicate, and that power would soon elevate him even further, to the leadership of one of New York's most powerful mafia families. But power, as always, came with a price. The very efficiency that made Anastasia so valuable also made him dangerous to those who sought to control him. His temper, his unpredictability, and his growing ambition were becoming liabilities in the eyes of some. For now, though, he was at the height of his influence, presiding over a network of killers that kept the underworld in line. Somewhere, though, the seeds of his eventual downfall were already being planted. Allies watched him carefully, wondering if one day he might turn his power against them. Rivals whispered in backrooms, waiting for the moment when they could strike. But those moments were still years away. For the time being, Albert Anastasia was the man who decided who lived and who died, and he carried that power with chilling ease. The man who commanded the nation's deadliest hit squad was not always easy to understand. Albert Anastasia was a contradiction, a man of charm and brutal violence, capable of laughing one moment and flying into a murderous rage the next. It was this volatility that gave birth to one of his most enduring nicknames, the Mad Hatter. The press used it gleefully, and it stuck because it seemed to capture something essential about his character. There was a wildness to him, a sense that at any moment he might explode, and no one, not friends, not allies, not even his closest associates, could predict exactly when that explosion would come. Imagine Albert sitting in a restaurant, immaculately dressed, his dark hair slicked back, cigarette smoke curling lazily above his head as he enjoyed a plate of veal parmigiana. His men sat nearby, laughing quietly, respectful of his presence. To any stranger walking in, he might have looked like a businessman enjoying a quiet night out. And then, suddenly, with no warning, the atmosphere could change. A wrong look, a word spoken too loudly, a perceived slight, Albert would slam his fist on the table, shattering glasses, his voice rising like a whip crack. His men would freeze, knowing better than to intervene, and the unfortunate soul who had provoked him might be dragged outside to face whatever punishment Albert decided on in the heat of the moment. But as quickly as the storm came, it would pass. Albert would sit back down, light another cigarette, and finish his meal in silence, as though nothing had happened. This ability to switch from fury to calm gave him an air of danger that hung over every room he entered. People never knew which Albert they were going to get, the charming host who slapped you on the back and bought you a drink, or the executioner whose anger could end your life before dessert. Those who were close to him often said that he was not cruel by nature, not a sadist who killed for pleasure. Rather, he saw violence as a tool, something necessary to maintain respect and control. But his temper made that tool unpredictable. Unlike Carlo Gambino, who would smile while plotting a rival's downfall, Albert was impulsive, emotional, quick to act. This made him effective as an enforcer. Men feared him because they knew he might act in the moment, but it also made him dangerous to the very system he served. There are legendary stories from this period, stories told in hushed tones long after Albert was gone. One story has him personally beating a man nearly to death with his bare hands for cheating on a dockside deal. Another tells of him ordering a killing not because the victim posed a major threat, but because they had insulted him in public. Whether all these tales are true or embellished over time, they contributed to the mythology of Albert Anastasia as a man who could not be crossed without dire consequences. Yet there was a softer side to him that complicated the picture. He was known to be generous with friends, to take care of the families of men who went to prison for the family's business. At Christmas, he was said to hand out envelopes of cash to dockworkers, making sure they had food on the table and gifts for their children. This generosity bought loyalty, and loyalty was the cornerstone of Albert's power. Albert's home life added another layer to this duality. He was married to Elsa Barnisi and had children, and by many accounts, he was a devoted family man when he was at home. He could leave the violence of the streets at the door, sitting down to dinner with his wife and children as though he were just another hard-working father. But even here, the shadow of his other life was always present. He carried a gun even at home, kept watchful of who was coming and going, and rarely allowed himself to fully relax. His volatility was not only a personal trait but also a source of concern among other mob bosses. The commission valued order and discipline. Their system depended on carefully calculated decisions, on maintaining a balance of power that kept money flowing and law enforcement at bay. Albert's unpredictability made some of his peers nervous. They admired his efficiency but worried about what might happen if he acted rashly in a way that drew too much attention. In a world where discretion was prized, Albert sometimes burned too brightly. Still, his very unpredictability was part of what made him so feared. When Albert gave an order, there was no hesitation, no second chance. The men under him knew that failure was not an option. This aura of absolute authority kept Murder Incorporated running with brutal efficiency. There were no debates, no questions asked. When Albert said someone had to go, that was the end of the discussion. In quieter moments, perhaps late at night, one wonders if Albert ever reflected on the dual life he led, the man who could laugh with his children and then order a killing before sunrise. Those who knew him said he rarely spoke of regrets. He seemed to accept his life as it was, as though fate had set him on this path long ago when he was just a boy stepping off the boat from Calabria. The image of the Mad Hatter would follow him for the rest of his life, becoming part of the legend that surrounded him. It was a nickname that suggested madness, but in truth, there was a cold logic beneath Albert's outbursts. He used fear like a weapon, and the unpredictability of his temper made that weapon even sharper. Men feared not just what he might do, but when he might do it, and that fear kept them obedient. As the 1940s turned into the early 1950s, Albert Anastasia had become one of the most feared men in America. His reputation as a killer was unparalleled, his power on the waterfront unchallenged, and his name was known far beyond New York. But the same qualities that had brought him to the top, his temper, his ruthlessness, his need for control, would soon begin to isolate him from those around him. In the world of organized crime, isolation was dangerous. It was often the first step toward betrayal. For now, though, Albert was at his peak, the Mad Hatter, the Lord High Executioner, the man whose fury could shatter a room and whose smile could make you believe, for a moment, that you were safe. But safety in Albert's world was always temporary. Somewhere in the shadows, new threats were beginning to form, and Albert's unpredictable nature would soon put him on a collision course with the very system he had helped enforce. By the early 1930s, New York City had become a battleground. The streets were tense, the air thick with the threat of violence that could erupt at any moment. The underworld was at war, a war that historians would later call the Castellamarese War, named after the Sicilian town of Castellammare del Golfo, home to many of the old world bosses who were now fighting for control of America's underworld. On one side was Joe, the boss, Masuria, the reigning king of the Mafia in New York. On the other side stood Salvatore Maranzano, a calculating Sicilian don determined to overthrow Masuria's rule. And caught between them were the younger gangsters, men like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and enforcers like Albert Anastasia, who would ultimately tip the balance of power. The war was bloody, drawn out, and marked by betrayal after betrayal. Each week seemed to bring fresh headlines of gangland killings, men gunned down in their cars, shot outside their homes, ambushed on street corners. For the public, it was shocking, almost cinematic, an ongoing drama playing out in the newspapers. For the men inside it, it was deadly serious. Alliances shifted constantly, and no one knew who might be next. Albert Anastasia was, by this time, already known as a man who could handle the dirtiest work. He had proven himself on the docks and through his work with Murder Incorporated, and now he became a vital player in Luciano's efforts to survive the war and ultimately win it. Luciano and his allies believed that the old guard, men like Masuria and Maranzano, were holding the Mafia back, clinging to old Sicilian traditions that no longer fit the modern world. Luciano envisioned a new structure, one that would treat organized crime like a business rather than a series of personal fiefdoms. But before that vision could become reality, the war had to end, and that meant eliminating Masuria. The stories of the final days of Joe Masuria have been told many times, each version slightly different, but they all agree on one thing: Luciano and his faction plotted his assassination carefully, knowing that his death would open the door to the new order they wanted to build. Albert Anastasia was reportedly one of the trusted men brought in to ensure that the job was done cleanly. The meeting was arranged under the pretense of peace talks, but peace was the last thing on the agenda. Picture a quiet restaurant on Coney Island in April 1931. Joe Masuria sits at a table, enjoying a leisurely game of cards, unaware that this is to be his last meal. Luciano excuses himself to go to the bathroom, leaving Masuria alone with his killers. In that brief absence, the gunmen strike, several shots ringing out, Masuria slumping over the table, cards and coins scattering across the floor. The shooters vanish almost as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind a scene that would be splashed across every newspaper in New York the next morning. With Masuria gone, Maranzano briefly became the most powerful boss in New York, declaring himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. But Luciano and his allies had no interest in trading one tyrant for another. They soon realized that Maranzano, too, would have to go. The plan to eliminate him was even bolder, for Maranzano had surrounded himself with guards and rarely let his enemies near him. Albert Anastasia was again believed to have played a role, either in the planning or the execution of the hit. Luciano's men posed as tax agents to gain entry to Maranzano's office in September 1931. Once inside, they overpowered his guards and stabbed and shot him to death. It was a brutal but decisive act, one that effectively ended the Castellamarese War and allowed Luciano to implement his dream of a commission, a ruling council where all the major crime families would have representation, and where disputes could be settled without the need for constant bloodshed. For Albert, this was a turning point. He had proven his loyalty to Luciano, and in the new order that emerged from the war, loyalty was rewarded. He was given even greater control over the Brooklyn docks and became one of Luciano's trusted enforcers, a man whose word carried significant weight. The Castellammare's War had forged him in fire, transforming him from a local strongman into a national figure in organized crime. But war leaves scars, even on men who seem unshakable. Albert had seen friends and associates killed, had lived through months of paranoia where every knock on the door might have been the last. The experience hardened him, made him even more ruthless. If he had once hesitated before pulling the trigger, those hesitations were gone now. The war had taught him that survival depended on decisiveness, on acting before the other man had a chance. In the quiet after the war, there must have been a strange stillness on the streets. For years, the city had been used to the sound of gunfire echoing off brick walls, to the headlines screaming of another gangland slaying. Now, with the new commission in place, there was peace, but it was a peace maintained by men like Anastasia, whose job it was to make sure no one dared break it. Imagine Albert walking along the piers at night, the war finally over, the air cool and smelling of the river. He must have felt a sense of triumph, perhaps even destiny. He had survived where so many others had fallen. He had stood at Luciano's side and watched a new order rise from the ashes of the old. The world of the Mafia had been reshaped, and Albert Anastasia was now one of its most powerful architects. This period marked the beginning of what some would call the golden era of organized crime, an era when the Commission reigned supreme, when the Mafia operated with the efficiency of a corporation and the secrecy of a monastery. And as one of its most feared enforcers, Albert was about to step even deeper into the role that would define him for the rest of his life, the man who made sure the rules were obeyed, no matter the cost. The murders of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano were more than just the bloody climax of a gang war, they were the birth pangs of a new era. In the months that followed Maranzano's death, Charles "Lucky" Luciano began to reshape the American Mafia into something it had never been before, an organized, modern syndicate. Gone were the days of the capo di tutti capi, the single boss of bosses, whose word was law. Luciano understood that concentrating that much power in one man's hands only bred resentment and rebellion. He had seen what happened to Masuria and Maranzano, and he was determined not to meet the same fate. Instead, Luciano built something far more durable, the Commission. It was a council made up of the heads of the most powerful mafia families, each with an equal voice. This system, inspired by the corporate boards of America's legitimate business world, was designed to settle disputes, approve major actions, and maintain a balance of power that would keep the bloodshed to a minimum. For Luciano, it was genius, a way to keep order, avoid costly wars, and ensure that everyone made money. Albert Anastasia was among those who benefited most from this new structure. His loyalty during the Castellammare's War had been rewarded handsomely. Luciano and his allies gave him official control over the Brooklyn waterfront rackets, cementing his position as the undisputed power on the docks. No crate could be unloaded, no cargo shipped, without his approval. The unions were under his influence, the stevedores answered to his men, and the shipping companies knew better than to defy him. Picture the waterfront in the early morning, mist rolling in from the harbor, the silhouettes of cargo ships looming in the half-light. This was Albert's kingdom. He would sometimes appear on the piers personally, his sharp suit and fedora out of place among the sweaty longshoremen, but his presence sent a clear message: this was his territory, and nothing happened here without his blessing. With this power came enormous profits. Kickbacks from shipping companies, ghost payrolling, schemes where men were paid for jobs they never worked, theft of valuable goods from cargo holds, all of it added up to a fortune. And Albert's cut was significant. Money poured in, not just for him but for the entire family he represented. The waterfront rackets became one of the most lucrative sources of income for the Mafia, and Albert was at the center of it all. His influence was not limited to Brooklyn. With Luciano's support, he became a national figure, part of the syndicate's enforcement structure. When disputes arose between crime families in other cities, Philadelphia, Chicago, Cleveland, Albert might be consulted, or even dispatched, to ensure that the commission's will was carried out. His reputation as the Lord High Executioner gave weight to his presence. When Albert spoke, people listened, because they knew he had the power to make decisions that could mean life or death. This was perhaps the peak of Albert's sense of security. He was no longer just an enforcer, he was a man of status, a man whose seat at the table gave him legitimacy. He had climbed from being a condemned prisoner awaiting execution to becoming a key figure in the governing body of the American Mafia. That transformation must have felt almost surreal, as though fate itself had guided him. But there was another side to this new era, the need for discretion. Luciano's commission prized efficiency and order, but also invisibility. The goal was to keep the Mafia's activities out of the headlines, to run things so smoothly that law enforcement had nothing to grab onto. This meant that even someone as powerful as Albert had to keep a low profile, avoiding unnecessary violence that might attract attention. For a man like Albert, whose temper was legendary, this was a challenge. He tried, for a time, to temper his outbursts, to play the role of the calm, calculating boss. He attended commission meetings, dressed immaculately, spoke with authority. He was treated as an equal by men like Luciano, Costello, and Lansky. And yet, under the surface, that volatility still simmered, waiting for the right moment to break through. Meanwhile, Luciano himself faced increasing pressure from law enforcement. In 1936, he was convicted on charges of compulsory prostitution and sentenced to prison. This left a power vacuum at the top of the commission, one that Frank Costello and others would step in to fill. Through it all, Albert remained a steady force, continuing to control the docks and enforce the rules. In some ways, this was Albert's golden period, a time when his wealth grew, his influence expanded, and his word carried more weight than ever before. He was trusted not just by his own family but by the commission as a whole. When a problem needed solving, he was one of the men they turned to. At night, Albert would often entertain friends and associates at his favorite restaurants or clubs. He was known to be a gracious host, picking up the tab, making sure everyone had a good time. There was a sense that he had arrived, that he was no longer just a soldier but a true boss. For a man who had come from the rocky hills of Calabria with nothing, it must have been a moment of deep satisfaction. But even in these moments of triumph, Albert remained vigilant. The world he lived in did not allow for complacency. Betrayal could come from anywhere, from rivals, from supposed allies, even from within one's own family. Albert kept close watch on his men, rewarding loyalty but punishing even the slightest hint of disobedience. His control over the docks depended on fear as much as respect, and he was not about to let that control slip. The creation of the commission and Albert's elevation within it marked the start of a new chapter in his life, one where he would transition from being merely an executioner to a ruler in his own right. But as history would later show, the higher a man climbed in the mafia world, the more dangerous the ground beneath his feet became. Power brought wealth and respect, but it also brought envy and suspicion. For now, Albert's position seemed secure, but storms were already gathering far beyond the harbor lights. Somewhere in the shadows of New York's nightclubs and backrooms, other ambitious men were watching him, taking note of his temper, his growing independence, and perhaps wondering how long it would be before his power threatened theirs. For the moment, though, Albert Anastasia was at the height of his influence, his hands firmly on the levers of one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in America. The Mangano crime family was one of the oldest in New York, tracing its roots back to the days when Italian immigrants first organized for power and protection. At its head sat Vincent Mangano, a tall, stern man with old-school Sicilian values and a belief in hierarchy, respect, and tradition. His brother, Philip, served as his consigliere, his closest advisor, and together they ruled the family with a mix of quiet authority and calculated intimidation. Into this structure stepped Albert Anastasia, no longer just an enforcer but a man with his own power base, the Brooklyn docks. At first, the arrangement seemed mutually beneficial. Albert's control over the waterfront brought enormous profits to the Mangano family. The kickbacks, union control, and stolen cargo made everyone rich. For Vincent Mangano, Albert was a valuable lieutenant, someone who could keep the men in line and ensure that business ran smoothly. For Albert, having the official protection of the family allowed him to operate with greater freedom, expanding his influence beyond the peers and into other rackets. But it didn't take long for tensions to emerge. Vincent was a traditional boss, someone who believed in chain of command and unquestioned obedience. Albert, on the other hand, was a man used to acting on his own instincts. He was impulsive, fiery, and less interested in ceremony. Where Vincent preferred diplomacy and quiet resolutions, Albert often favored direct action, sometimes violent action. The first cracks appeared over money. Vincent began to suspect that Albert was keeping more than his fair share of the waterfront profits, skimming off the top before passing the rest to the family. Whether this was true or simply Vincent's paranoia is unclear, but the suspicion was enough to sour their relationship. Meetings grew tense, voices were raised, and what had once been a productive alliance became a constant battle of wills. Philip Mangano, the more diplomatic of the two brothers, often tried to smooth things over, encouraging Vincent to see Albert's value and encouraging Albert to show more respect to the boss. But Albert's temper did not make compromise easy. He believed he had earned his position through blood and risk, and he did not appreciate being second-guessed. To him, the docks were his domain, and no one, not even Vincent Mangano, was going to tell him how to run them. There are accounts of shouting matches between the two men, of meetings where Vincent stormed out in anger and Albert sat silently smoking, his jaw clenched. It was not just about money anymore, it was about control, about pride. Vincent reportedly accused Albert of being too close to men outside the family, particularly Frank Costello and Lucky Luciano, with whom Albert maintained strong ties. To Vincent, this smelled of disloyalty, as though Albert was aligning himself with outsiders instead of standing with his own family. For Albert, the accusations must have felt like an insult. Loyalty was everything to him, and to be accused of betrayal was no small thing. But the truth was that Albert was a man who straddled two worlds, the local loyalty to the Mangano family and the broader loyalty to the Commission. If there was ever a conflict between the two, it is likely that Albert would have sided with the Commission, which valued him highly as a stabilizing force on the docks. The tension continued to escalate. Vincent reportedly began speaking openly of his dislike for Albert, calling him too ambitious, saying that he was acting more like a boss than a subordinate. In the mafia world, such talk was dangerous. To accuse a man of trying to usurp power was to put him on notice, and to justify, in some cases, a move against him. Albert, for his part, did not back down. If anything, he seemed to grow more defiant. He surrounded himself with loyal men, ensuring that his power on the docks could not be challenged. Some historians believe that by this point, Albert was already considering taking over the family outright. Whether that was his plan all along or a decision born of frustration is hard to say, but one thing is certain, the relationship between Anastasia and the Manganos had become a powder keg waiting to explode. The atmosphere within the family was tense, almost unbearable. Soldiers whispered among themselves, wondering if there would be blood. The Mangano brothers were respected, but Albert was feared, and in the mafia, fear often carried more weight. If a confrontation came, many suspected that Albert would emerge the victor. Philip Mangano tried to keep the peace, but even he could see that things were reaching a breaking point. He continued to mediate, to argue for restraint, but restraint was not one of Albert's strengths. Each confrontation seemed to bring them closer to an irreversible decision. Outside the family, other bosses watched with interest. Men like Carlo Gambino, who served as Albert's underboss, took careful note of the growing divide. Gambino was patient, calculating, and far more reserved than Albert. He rarely raised his voice, preferring to let others make the mistakes that would eventually elevate him. For now, he remained in Albert's shadow, but he must have understood that the coming conflict could change everything. In the quiet of night, one can imagine Albert pacing in his home, the lights low, the air heavy with cigarette smoke. Perhaps he thought about the path that had brought him here, from Calabria to the docks, from condemned killer to feared enforcer, and now to a position where he was butting heads with the men who were supposed to be his allies. He may have felt cornered, betrayed, convinced that Vincent Mangano would not stop until he had removed him from power. In the mafia world, there are few ways to resolve such a conflict. One is to submit and accept whatever punishment the boss decides. Another is to strike first. Albert was not the type to submit. He was a man of action, a man who had survived too much to go quietly. And so, slowly but surely, the path toward bloodshed was set. The final confrontation had not yet come, but the writing was on the wall. The uneasy alliance between Albert Anastasia and the Mangano brothers was crumbling, and everyone knew that something, or someone, would have to give. The question was no longer if there would be violence, but when. And when it came, it would change the shape of the New York underworld forever. By the early 1950s, the tension between Albert Anastasia and the Mangano brothers had reached a breaking point. The meetings had become colder, the conversations shorter, and the threats, though veiled, were unmistakable. Vincent Mangano could no longer hide his anger. He accused Albert of insubordination, of growing too powerful, of making decisions without the family's approval. In the mafia, these were dangerous accusations, for they were the kind of charges that could justify a sanctioned hit. Albert must have known that the next step might be an order for his own execution, and if he knew anything from his years as the Lord High Executioner, he knew that when death is coming, the man who strikes first usually survives. April 1951 began like any other month, but in the shadows, plans were being set into motion. Philip Mangano's body was the first to be found. He was discovered face down in a marshland area near Jamaica Bay, shot several times and left to rot. The news spread quickly through the underworld. Philip had been the calmer of the two brothers, the one who had always tried to smooth things over, the one who sought compromise. His death was a message as clear as any contract ever taken out by Murder Incorporated. Albert Anastasia was done compromising. But Vincent Mangano's fate was even more chilling. He simply vanished. There was no body, no crime scene, no witnesses. One day he was the boss of one of New York's oldest crime families, and the next he was gone, as though the city had swallowed him whole. For decades, his body was never recovered, leading to endless speculation about where he was buried, or whether he was buried at all. Perhaps he was dumped at sea, perhaps buried in an unmarked grave, perhaps dissolved in acid. The mystery of Vincent Mangano's disappearance remains one of the enduring legends of mafia history. The Commission, the governing council of the mafia, was informed of the situation, and here is where Albert's loyalty to the syndicate paid off. The other bosses could have condemned him, could have stripped him of his power for killing his own boss without permission. But Albert was too valuable. He had been loyal to Luciano and Costello for years, had kept the docks running smoothly, and had been one of the most reliable enforcers the syndicate had ever seen. Instead of punishment, Albert was rewarded. The commission approved his ascension to boss of the family. The Mangano crime family became the Anastasia crime family, and Albert sat at the top as its undisputed leader. Imagine Albert in those first days as boss, perhaps sitting in a quiet room, the tension of the past years finally lifted from his shoulders. He had won. The brothers who had tried to control him were gone, and he had not only survived but emerged stronger. It must have felt like destiny, the culmination of everything he had fought for since arriving in America as a teenage immigrant. The docks were his, the family was his, and he now had a seat at the commission not just as an enforcer but as a full-fledged boss. But victory was a double-edged sword. Taking out a boss, even with commission approval after the fact, was no small matter. It marked Albert as a man capable of anything, a man who would not hesitate to eliminate even the highest-ranking rival if he felt threatened. This inspired fear among his men, but it also planted seeds of suspicion among his peers. If he could kill Vincent Mangano, what was to stop him from killing anyone else who stood in his way? Still, for a time, Albert ruled with absolute authority. He reorganized the family in his own image, promoting loyal men to key positions and tightening his grip on the waterfront rackets. His underboss, Carlo Gambino, was quiet and calculating, a man who preferred to work behind the scenes. Together they expanded their influence into other lucrative areas: garment industry, trucking, construction rackets, loan sharking, and gambling. Money flowed into the family coffers, and Albert's personal wealth grew to staggering levels. To the outside world, Albert was now a figure of near-mythic fear. The newspapers ran stories about the Lord High Executioner, who had risen to boss of one of the 5 families. Law enforcement agencies watched him carefully, hoping for a slip-up that might lead to an indictment, but Albert was careful. He had learned from Luciano and Costello how to protect himself legally, using intermediaries, keeping his name off documents, making sure nothing could be traced directly back to him. And yet, even as he enjoyed his new power, Albert's temper did not fade. If anything, it became sharper. He no longer had to answer to Vincent Mangano, no longer had to restrain himself at tense sit-downs. When Albert gave an order now, it was absolute, final. Those who defied him faced swift consequences. Some men who had been loyal to the Mangano brothers began to disappear, one by one. The family was being purged of anyone Albert suspected might harbor resentment or thoughts of revenge. The underworld took notice. Albert had not just taken over, he had seized power through murder and reshaped the family through fear. The message was clear: this was no longer the Mangano family. This was Anastasia's family. His word was law, and his wrath was lethal. Still, Albert was not simply a tyrant. He also rewarded loyalty lavishly, handing out promotions, sharing wealth with trusted lieutenants, and making sure the men who stood with him during the transition were taken care of. This built a core of devoted soldiers who would follow him anywhere. For a time, the family thrived, stronger and richer than ever. But outside forces were beginning to shift. The FBI was starting to take more interest in organized crime. The Kefauver hearings in the early 1950s brought unprecedented public attention to the Mafia, exposing its influence over industries like shipping and construction. With the spotlight growing brighter, bosses across New York grew more cautious, more careful about how they conducted business. Albert, however, was not a man given to subtlety or patience. His very personality, fiery, uncompromising, would soon put him at odds with men who preferred to operate quietly. For now, though, Albert was at the height of his power. He had survived the most dangerous gamble of his life, removed his enemies, and claimed the throne of a crime family. The boy from Calabria who had once faced the electric chair was now one of the most powerful gangsters in America. But power, especially in the world of organized crime, was always temporary, always fragile. Somewhere in the shadows, other men were already taking measure of their new boss, watching, waiting, and thinking about the future. Albert Anastasia may have been the boss of the family now, but he was not running it alone. Standing just to his right was his underboss, Carlo Gambino, a man as different from Albert as night is from day. Where Albert was fiery, impulsive, and sometimes explosive, Carlo was quiet, patient, and almost invisible in the way he moved through the world. He was a man who understood the value of staying in the background, letting others draw the attention while he slowly and carefully built power. At first, the partnership seemed ideal. Albert brought the fear, the raw authority that kept the soldiers in line. Carlo brought the diplomacy, the long-term strategy, the careful network building that kept alliances strong and profitable. Together, they were unstoppable. Under their leadership, the family expanded its reach far beyond the Brooklyn waterfront. They had their hands in the garment district's trucking unions, the construction trades, loan sharking operations, gambling dens, and even parts of the growing narcotics trade. Money flowed like water. Every week, envelopes stuffed with cash made their way up the chain, from street-level bookies and Shylocks to captains and lieutenants, and finally to Albert and Carlo at the top. The family's earnings soared, and its soldiers prospered under the new regime. For the moment, everyone seemed content. But beneath the surface, subtle currents were shifting. Carlo Gambino was not a man to challenge his boss openly. He smiled in meetings, agreed with Albert's decisions, and carried out his orders faithfully. Yet he also watched, listened, and waited. Gambino had an instinct for survival and a knack for politics. He understood that Albert's temper, the very thing that had helped him seize power, might one day be his undoing. All Carlo had to do was be ready when that day came. Albert, for his part, seemed to trust Gambino, or at least value his counsel. He relied on him to keep the captains organized, to settle disputes before they reached his desk, and to negotiate with other families when diplomacy was required. Gambino's quiet, almost humble demeanor may have lulled Albert into a sense of security. To Albert, Carlo was useful, loyal, and not a threat. Meanwhile, the empire they controlled was becoming more complex. The waterfront rackets remained Albert's personal kingdom, but Gambino began to take on more and more responsibility for other ventures. He was particularly skilled at cultivating relationships with businessmen and politicians, the kind of alliances that provided protection when law enforcement came too close. It was said that Gambino rarely raised his voice, rarely made threats. Instead, he persuaded. He offered deals that were too good to refuse, and he remembered every favor owed. Together, Albert and Carlo became a formidable duo, the visible fist and the invisible hand. Their family grew stronger than ever, rivaling even the Genovese and Lucchese families in power and profits. And yet, the very success they enjoyed brought new challenges. The more money that flowed through the family, the more attention it drew, not just from rivals but from federal investigators. The 1950s were a time when law enforcement was beginning to take organized crime more seriously. The famous Kefauver Committee hearings had put the Mafia in the national spotlight, broadcasting images of mobsters on live television and shocking Americans with the scale of organized crime's reach. For many bosses, this was a signal to keep their heads down, to avoid unnecessary violence or flamboyant displays of wealth. Albert, however, did not always share this cautious approach. He could be brash, sometimes reckless, ordering hits that made headlines or openly flaunting his power. To men like Carlo Gambino, this behavior was dangerous. Carlo believed in subtlety, in building power so quietly that no one noticed until it was too late. The contrast between the two men became clearer with each passing year. Still, Gambino never openly opposed his boss. He continued to play the role of the loyal underboss, even as he quietly strengthened his own base of support within the family. He cultivated captains who respected his calm demeanor and business sense. He built alliances with other families, notably the Genovese family, whose boss, Vito Genovese, was himself plotting to reshape the mafia hierarchy in his favor. If Albert noticed any of this, he gave no sign. He was too busy running his empire, enforcing discipline on the docks, and enjoying the fruits of his power. He had survived so much: prison, a death sentence, gang wars, and internal betrayal, that he may have believed he was untouchable. His nickname, the Mad Hatter, was still whispered with a mixture of fear and respect, and few dared challenge him directly. But power in the Mafia is always fragile. The Commission was watching, as were Albert's rivals. Some saw him as too unpredictable, too quick to anger, too willing to use violence when diplomacy might suffice. For a time, Carlo Gambino remained the loyal second-in-command, but in his mind, the long game was already in motion. Imagine the two men sitting across from each other in a quiet restaurant, Albert speaking animatedly about a problem on the waterfront, Gambino listening silently, nodding occasionally. Outwardly, it was a picture of harmony, the boss and his underboss sharing a meal, discussing business. But in Carlo's mind, perhaps, plans were forming. He was patient, far more patient than Albert. He could wait months, even years, for the right moment to strike. And that moment would eventually come. But not yet. For now, the partnership held, and the family thrived under their joint leadership. The soldiers were paid, the captains were satisfied, and the money kept flowing. But the seeds of future betrayal were already planted. As the 1950s moved toward their later years, Albert Anastasia stood at the peak of his power, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that the man who sat at his right hand might one day be the man who would see him replaced. For now, Carlo Gambino waited in the shadows, smiling softly, quietly preparing for the day when the family would no longer belong to the Mad Hatter, but to him. The early to mid-1950s marked the high point of Albert Anastasia's reign. By this time, his name had become synonymous with fear, not just in New York, but across the country. To the public, he was a shadowy figure, his face occasionally splashed across newspapers under headlines that spoke of gangland slayings and waterfront corruption. To the men of the underworld, he was something far more tangible, a living reminder that the rules of the Mafia were not suggestions but commandments, and that the price for breaking them was death. Albert carried himself like a man who knew he was untouchable. When he entered a room, the air seemed to shift. Conversations grew quiet, men straightened in their chairs, and even hardened gangsters felt a chill in his presence. His reputation as the Lord High Executioner was by now legendary. It was said that if Albert Anastasia put your name on a list, there was nowhere in America you could hide. The killers who worked under him would find you, whether you were in New York, Miami, or Los Angeles. This aura of fear was not just built on legend, it was carefully maintained. Albert understood the power of theater in the underworld. When someone needed to be made an example of, the killing was done in a way that sent a message to everyone watching. A man might be gunned down on a busy street in broad daylight, his body riddled with bullets, so that no one could mistake what had happened. Or a victim might simply vanish, leaving behind an empty apartment and unanswered questions, a quieter but equally chilling warning. The docks remained Albert's stronghold, his personal empire. Every ship that came into Brooklyn's piers brought more money into his pockets. Cargo was stolen, kickbacks were collected, and union leaders were kept firmly under control. Even legitimate businessmen knew that the only way to operate smoothly was to deal with Albert's people. A refusal to cooperate could mean a labor strike, a fire at a warehouse, or worse. Albert did not just rely on fear, he also relied on loyalty. He rewarded those who served him faithfully, making sure his soldiers were well paid and their families looked after. He was known to hand out money at Christmas, to quietly help the widows of men who had gone to prison, to ensure that loyalty was not just demanded but earned. This combination of fear and generosity made his power nearly absolute. But his influence went beyond Brooklyn. Albert was now a national figure, consulted on major decisions affecting the entire Mafia. The Commission valued him as an enforcer, a man who could keep rebellious factions in line. If a family boss in another city stepped out of line, it was often Albert's men who were sent to deliver the final warning, or to carry out the sentence if the warning was ignored. Law enforcement, of course, was not blind to his activities. The FBI and local police departments launched investigations, convened grand juries, tried to find witnesses willing to testify. But time and again, cases fell apart. Witnesses recanted, disappeared, or refused to take the stand. Albert's reputation was such that even the threat of testifying against him was enough to terrify most men into silence. In public, Albert was almost serene. He could sit for hours in a restaurant or a club, quietly eating or drinking, his expression calm. But those who knew him best understood that beneath that calm exterior was a man who could unleash violence without hesitation. He was not a sadist, not someone who killed for pleasure, but he believed firmly in the code of respect and retribution. If someone wronged him or the family, there would be consequences. Stories from this era painted him as almost mythical. Some said he had personally carried out dozens of murders with his own hands. Others claimed the number was closer to hundreds. The truth is difficult to know, many of his alleged victims simply disappeared, leaving behind no trace but a whisper. What mattered was not the exact number but the perception. Albert Anastasia was a man who could decide life and death with a single word. The soldiers under him were fiercely loyal. They knew that serving Albert meant protection, profit, and prestige. But they also knew that failure was not an option. If a job was botched, if money went missing, if a soldier disobeyed orders, punishment was swift and final. In this way, Albert maintained order within his family, keeping everyone focused and disciplined. This period was, in many ways, the golden age of his power. He had survived countless challenges, eliminated rivals, and now stood as one of the most feared bosses in mafia history. The newspapers could speculate, the police could investigate, but nothing seemed to touch him. Yet power at this level often brings with it a dangerous side effect: paranoia. As the 1950s wore on, Albert began to sense that enemies were closing in, that plots were being formed behind his back. Perhaps it was just the natural result of years spent looking over his shoulder. Perhaps it was justified. In the world Albert inhabited, there was always someone waiting for a moment of weakness, someone willing to take your place if you slipped. For now, though, he remained on top. The city was his, the docks were his, and the fear he inspired kept him safe. Men who thought of crossing him often thought twice, and those who didn't rarely lived long enough to regret it. Imagine Albert at this time, sitting in a dimly lit room at night, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling, a ledger open on the table in front of him. The numbers showed millions flowing through his hands, a fortune built on fear and efficiency. Outside, the streets of Brooklyn were quiet, the piers locked down, the city under his invisible control. It must have seemed, in that moment, that nothing could touch him. But power in the mafia is a double-edged sword. The higher a man climbs, the more dangerous the fall. Albert Anastasia was at the very peak now, and though he could not yet see it, the ground beneath him was beginning to tremble. The fear that kept others in line would one day turn against him, and when it did, the end would come as suddenly and violently as everything else in his life. The peak of Albert Anastasia's reign was also the beginning of his most dangerous period, a time when the very ruthlessness that had built his empire started drawing too much attention. One of the defining moments of this era was a case that became infamous in both the press and the streets, the so-called Brooklyn Vampire case. It was a killing so shocking, so brazen, that it pierced the veil of secrecy the mafia relied on and brought the weight of public outrage crashing down on Albert's world. The case began with a crime that had horrified even hardened police detectives. In 1941, a man named Willie Gallo, nicknamed the Brooklyn Vampire by the newspapers, was accused of the brutal murder of a young girl. Gallo was no mobster, he was a drifter, a man with a history of mental illness, who became the target of widespread public anger. He was arrested, charged, and set to face trial. But before justice could take its course, something strange happened. Willie Gallo was murdered while in custody, shot to death by gangsters in what was clearly a contract hit. The message was clear: someone had decided that the courts were not moving fast enough, that Gallo deserved immediate retribution. Rumors began to swirl that the hit had been ordered by Albert Anastasia himself. To many, it made sense. Anastasia was known to be a man who hated degenerates, as he called them, and believed they should be eliminated. In his mind, perhaps this was not murder but justice, swift, uncompromising justice. But the killing sparked a firestorm. Newspapers splashed the story across their front pages, asking how a man in police custody could have been executed so easily. The public was outraged, not just at the crime that had started it all but at the idea that mobsters were now acting as judge, jury, and executioner in the streets of New York. For law enforcement, it was an embarrassment. The police had been unable to protect their prisoner, and it made them look powerless against the mafia's reach. Albert, of course, never admitted to ordering the hit. There was no direct evidence tying him to the murder, no witness willing to testify. But the whispers grew louder, and for many, this was the moment when Anastasia's reputation shifted from fearsome to almost mythic. He was no longer just the man who enforced the mafia's will, he was seen as someone who could decide who deserved to live or die in society at large. Some admired him for it, saying he had done what the courts could not. Others were terrified, seeing in him a man who had placed himself above the law entirely. The heat from the case was intense. Investigators began digging deeper into Anastasia's operations, looking for any crack in his empire they could exploit. The FBI renewed its focus on the waterfront rackets, and state prosecutors began calling witnesses before grand juries. For a man who valued secrecy above all else, this was a dangerous development. But Albert did not hide. If anything, he seemed emboldened by the attention. He continued to run the family with an iron fist, making sure his men knew that nothing had changed. If the government wanted to come after him, so be it. He would not show weakness. Still, there were costs to this defiance. The Brooklyn vampire case had made him a household name, and that was not the way mafia bosses preferred to operate. Men like Frank Costello and Carlo Gambino believed in keeping a low profile, in staying out of the headlines. To them, Albert's actions, even if they were understandable in the code of the underworld, were reckless. They drew unnecessary attention and risked bringing the full force of the government down on everyone. Inside the family, some began to whisper about whether Albert's temper was getting the better of him, whether he was too quick to act, too eager to use violence when patience might serve better. In the world of organized crime, drawing attention could be as dangerous as betrayal. The public outrage did not die down quickly. Editorials called for reform, for stronger protections for prisoners, for a crackdown on organized crime. The image of the mafia as an invisible government pulling strings behind the scenes took root in the public imagination. And at the center of that image was Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter who seemed capable of anything. In quiet moments, perhaps even Albert began to feel the pressure. The walls were closing in, just a little. More surveillance, more questioning, more heat on the docks. And paranoia, once it takes root, does not easily let go. Albert began to trust fewer people, to watch his men more closely. If the government could not get to him, they might try to turn someone close to him, and Albert was determined not to let that happen. At night, the city was still under his control, the waterfront still answered to him, but there was a shift in the air. The public mood had changed. The press was no longer just reporting on gangland killings as curiosities, they were portraying the mafia as a national menace. Politicians began campaigning on promises to crack down on organized crime. The spotlight was growing hotter, and Albert was standing directly in its beam. The Brooklyn vampire case may not have been the beginning of Albert Anastasia's downfall, but it was one of the first moments when the forces outside the underworld began to close ranks against him. It marked the start of a new kind of scrutiny, relentless, public, and determined to bring down the man who had long seemed untouchable. For a man who had built his life on control, this loss of control must have been unsettling. Perhaps he felt the first stirrings of something he had rarely felt before, vulnerability. And in the world Albert inhabited, vulnerability was the one thing you could never afford to show. Courtrooms have a certain smell, a mix of polished wood, old paper, and nervous sweat. For most men, standing trial is a harrowing experience, the kind that keeps them awake at night, heart pounding, palms slick. But for Albert Anastasia, the courtroom became almost routine, a place where he would sit calmly, impeccably dressed, watching the proceedings as though he already knew how they would end. And more often than not, he did. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, law enforcement made repeated attempts to bring down the man they called the Lord High Executioner. Investigators targeted his control over the Brooklyn docks, his alleged role in dozens of gangland murders, even his suspected connection to the infamous Brooklyn vampire case. They gathered witnesses, assembled grand juries, and filed indictments. And yet, time after time, the cases fell apart like sand slipping through their fingers. The pattern became so familiar it was almost eerie. A witness would agree to testify, a union man, a frightened bookkeeper, a dockworker who had seen too much. The prosecutors would prepare their case, confident that this time they had the evidence to convict. And then, just before the trial, something would happen. The witness would vanish, sometimes literally disappearing off the face of the earth. Other times, he would take the stand, glance toward the defense table where Albert sat, and suddenly forget everything he had previously told the police. "I don't remember," he would say. "I was mistaken." Without testimony, the case would crumble, the jury would acquit, and Albert would walk free, adjusting his cufflinks with quiet dignity as though it had all been an inconvenience rather than a brush with life imprisonment. To the newspapers, this pattern was infuriating. They began to paint a picture of a justice system powerless in the face of mafia intimidation. Headlines blared, "Witness disappears in Anastasia case, another mistrial for Doc Boss." The public followed these cases with grim fascination, wondering how one man could escape accountability over and over. To Albert's enemies, it made him seem almost superhuman, as if fate itself refused to let him fall. Inside the courtroom, Albert was the picture of composure. He rarely spoke, allowing his lawyers to do the talking, but his presence was commanding. He sat upright, eyes calm but piercing, exuding the quiet confidence of a man who believed he would walk out the front door when it was over. There was no fidgeting, no visible anxiety. Even when the evidence seemed damning, he betrayed no fear. Some prosecutors would later say that trying to convict Albert Anastasia was like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. No matter how solid the case appeared, it would evaporate at the last moment. There were whispers that jurors were being tampered with, that judges were under pressure, that police officers themselves were leaking information to Albert's lawyers. Whether these rumors were true or simply born of frustration, they added to the growing legend of a man who could not be touched by the law. For Albert, these courtroom victories were more than just legal triumphs, they were psychological warfare. Every acquittal reinforced his image as untouchable, as a man beyond the reach of ordinary justice. It sent a message to rivals, to potential traitors, and even to his own men: Albert Anastasia was not a man to be brought down by the courts. If you wanted to remove him, you would have to do it the old-fashioned way, with bullets. There was an almost dreamlike quality to these years. Imagine being a bystander, watching case after case collapse, seeing Albert leave the courthouse surrounded by reporters and photographers, his face unreadable as flashbulbs exploded in the night. The world outside the courtroom might have been clamoring for justice, but inside those walls, it was as though time bent in his favor. Yet beneath the calm exterior, Albert must have felt the growing pressure. Each trial was a reminder that law enforcement was closing in, that the government would not rest until it had him behind bars. The more cases they brought, the more resources they devoted to taking him down. The FBI was now deeply invested in tracking organized crime, and the spotlight on Albert burned hotter with every passing year. At night, perhaps Albert allowed himself to think about what might happen if one day the pattern broke, if one witness didn't disappear, if one jury didn't flinch. The thought must have been chilling, even for a man who had stared death in the face before. It may have fueled the paranoia that was beginning to grow inside him, the creeping sense that he was surrounded by threats not just from law enforcement but from his own world as well. But in the moment, the trials always ended the same way. The judge would dismiss the charges, or the jury would acquit. Albert would stand, shake hands with his attorneys, and walk past the press with the faintest trace of a smile. To the ordinary citizen, it seemed impossible. To Albert, it must have felt inevitable, as if destiny itself was on his side. These courtroom dramas only added to the mystique of the Mad Hatter. He became not just a gangster but a symbol, a man who embodied both the fear and fascination that Americans felt toward the Mafia. To some, he was a villain who had cheated justice too many times. To others, he was almost a folk hero, a man who played by his own rules and always seemed to win. The dreamlike run of acquittals could not last forever, of course. Every time Albert walked free, the determination to bring him down only grew stronger. Prosecutors began to think more creatively, looking for ways to attack his empire indirectly, through tax cases, labor racketeering charges, and conspiracy indictments. But for now, the record stood: Albert Anastasia had faced the law again and walked away every time. It was as though he lived under a kind of spell, one that shielded him from the consequences of his choices. But in the underworld, every spell has its breaking point. And for Albert, that breaking point was approaching, not from a courtroom this time, but from men who were plotting his death in secret. The dreamlike calm of the courtroom years would soon give way to a storm he would not escape. Power can be intoxicating, but it can also be corrosive. By the mid-1950s, Albert Anastasia had been at the top for several years, his family stronger than ever, his control over the docks unquestioned. Yet something had changed in him. The calm confidence he once displayed had begun to fray at the edges. Those closest to him started to notice small shifts, the way his eyes would dart more frequently across a room, the way his voice would rise unexpectedly, the way his meetings stretched late into the night as he interrogated his own men about their loyalty. Paranoia is an invisible poison. It seeps in quietly, drop by drop, until every shadow seems threatening and every whisper sounds like a conspiracy. Albert had survived too much, seen too many betrayals, to trust easily. But now, trust was becoming almost impossible. The pressure from law enforcement was unrelenting, more subpoenas, more grand juries, more federal attention on the docks. And inside the mafia world, rivals were circling, waiting for the moment when the Mad Hatter would make a mistake big enough to justify removing him. He began taking extra precautions. His security detail grew larger. He changed his daily routines, never taking the same route twice, never staying in one place longer than necessary. Friends would later recall that he would sometimes sit alone in the corner of a restaurant, scanning every face that walked in, as though he could feel danger approaching even before it was visible. His temper, always a volatile part of his personality, became even more unpredictable. A man who displeased him could find himself beaten savagely, sometimes by Albert's own hands. There were stories of him flying into rages over trivial matters, a late delivery, a disrespectful glance, a rumor he thought was spreading behind his back. These explosions of violence sent a chill through the family. Soldiers who had once felt protected by their boss now feared that they could be the next target if they said the wrong thing at the wrong time. This fear kept the family obedient, but it also created cracks. Some of the men began quietly seeking alliances elsewhere, whispering to Gambino or even to members of other families. They wanted protection, insurance in case Albert's paranoia turned on them. In the world of organized crime, perception is everything, and the perception now was that Albert was becoming unstable, and instability could be fatal, not just for him but for everyone connected to him. The commission, too, had begun to grow uneasy. The other bosses had tolerated Albert's fiery nature for years, partly out of respect and partly out of fear. But his unpredictability was starting to threaten the delicate balance they had built. The commission was supposed to be a governing body that avoided unnecessary killings, that kept business smooth and steady. Albert's impulsive decisions, ordering hits that drew public attention, openly threatening rivals, risked bringing chaos back to the underworld. One particularly controversial decision came when Albert reportedly ordered the murder of several high-profile figures without first seeking commission approval. This was a violation of the rules, one that could not be ignored forever. To his peers, it was a sign that Albert might no longer be playing by the same code that bound them all together. And then there was his relationship with Carlo Gambino. On the surface, it remained cordial. Gambino still served as his underboss, still carried out his orders with quiet efficiency. But Carlo was a patient man, a strategist who understood that timing was everything. He began strengthening his alliances with Vito Genovese, the powerful boss of the Genovese family, who had his own reasons for wanting Albert gone. Albert may have sensed this growing conspiracy. The paranoia that had once been a whisper in the back of his mind was now a constant companion. He questioned the loyalty of everyone around him, from captains to soldiers. He held more private meetings, sometimes summoning men in the middle of the night to demand explanations for their actions. This constant pressure created an atmosphere of fear, one that only deepened the isolation around him. At home, the paranoia followed him. He was said to have kept multiple firearms within easy reach, checking locks and windows repeatedly, sometimes pacing for hours. Sleep came less easily. The man who had once been the calm, efficient executioner was now a man haunted by the very world he had helped create. And yet, even in this state, Albert remained dangerous. A paranoid boss can be even more lethal than a rational one, because he strikes quickly, convinced that every move against him must be preempted. Several men suspected of plotting against him turned up dead, their bodies discovered in alleys or abandoned lots. Whether these men were actually traitors or simply victims of Albert's growing suspicion is impossible to say. To the outside world, nothing seemed amiss. The money still flowed, the docks still ran smoothly, and the family still held its territory. But inside, those who knew Albert best could feel the tension tightening like a wire ready to snap. There was a sense that something was coming, something inevitable, something violent. Imagine Albert during these last years, sitting alone in his car late at night, the city lights reflecting off the windshield. Perhaps he lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply, staring out at the empty streets. He had fought his way to the top through blood and fire, but now the top felt like a trap, a place where there was nowhere left to climb and nowhere to run. Paranoia had once kept him alive, it had made him cautious, made him strike before others could strike him. But now, it was consuming him, isolating him from allies, turning his soldiers into suspects, and leaving him vulnerable to the one threat he could not predict, betrayal from the man closest to him. Albert Anastasia was still the boss, still feared, still powerful. But the world around him had changed, and he had changed with it. The storm was building, and somewhere in the darkness, his enemies were already preparing to make their move. Betrayal in the Mafia rarely happens overnight. It is not a single conversation, not a single decision, but a quiet accumulation of moments, whispers, and calculations that eventually harden into action. For Albert Anastasia, the betrayal that would end his life was years in the making, and it came not from his enemies on the street but from the men who had once been his closest allies. Carlo Gambino had served as Albert's underboss for years, watching, learning, and quietly building his own base of power. He was a patient man, never one to act impulsively, and he had a gift for reading the currents of power in the underworld. By the late 1950s, Carlo could see that Albert's volatility was becoming a liability, not just to the family but to the commission itself. Albert's temper was too unpredictable, his hits too public, his defiance too dangerous. If left unchecked, he could bring unnecessary heat down on all of them. In Gambino's mind, the solution was clear: Albert had to go. But removing a sitting boss was no small thing. It required more than ambition, it required permission. The commission did not look kindly on unauthorized hits on family bosses. Such actions risked open war, and war was bad for business. Carlo needed allies, and he needed them at the highest level. Enter Vito Genovese. The ambitious boss of the Genovese family had his own plans for reshaping the mafias. Balance of power. Genovese had spent years consolidating control after engineering the exile of Lucky Luciano and the near retirement of Frank Costello. He saw Albert Anastasia as an obstacle, a man whose unpredictability threatened the stability he wanted to build. When Carlo approached him, the alliance was almost inevitable. The two men met quietly, away from prying eyes, in safe houses and discreet back rooms. The conversations would have been calm, almost polite, but beneath the civility lay cold calculation. Gambino presented the case: Albert was out of control, and his removal would benefit not just their families but the entire commission. Genovese agreed, and with his backing, Gambino had the political cover he needed to move forward. Other bosses were consulted, or at least informed. Some may have hesitated, wary of the precedent being set. But Albert had made many enemies over the years, and few were willing to risk their own standing by defending him. In the end, the decision was made: Albert Anastasia, boss of the Anastasia family and Lord High Executioner of the Mafia, would be executed. Planning the hit was no small task. Albert was a careful man, always armed, always surrounded by loyal bodyguards. To catch him off guard would require precision. Carlo and Genovese chose their killers with care, selecting men who could be trusted to act swiftly and disappear afterward. The plan was to strike in a place where Albert would feel safe, where he would let his guard down, and that place would be the barbershop. It was a masterstroke of strategy. The Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan had a barbershop that Albert was known to frequent. He went there often enough that his routine was predictable, and because it was a public place, he would usually go without his full complement of bodyguards. In the barbershop chair, Albert was at his most vulnerable, seated, relaxed, covered by a white cape, his vision limited by the mirrors and the steam of hot towels. Imagine the conspirators finalizing their plan in hushed voices, maps and timetables spread out before them, their faces calm but their minds cold. They were not merely planning a murder, they were planning the removal of a king. When the job was done, the world of the Mafia would tilt on its axis. Albert may have sensed that something was wrong in those final weeks. His paranoia had grown acute, and he had been warned more than once that there were men plotting against him. But paranoia is a cruel thing, it tells you that danger is everywhere, which makes it harder to see where the real danger lies. Albert may have been watching the streets, the docks, his captains, perhaps even suspecting rival families. But he does not seem to have suspected Carlo Gambino, the quiet underboss who had served at his right hand for so many years. There is a certain tragic poetry to this. Albert had made a career of striking first, of eliminating threats before they could eliminate him. But in this case, he waited too long. Perhaps he believed his reputation would protect him. Perhaps he thought that no one would dare make a move against him without facing retaliation. If so, he miscalculated, because this time, the move was sanctioned, the killers had permission, and the retaliation would never come. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Albert left for the Park Sheraton Hotel, unaware that this would be the last trip of his life. The killers were already in position, waiting for the moment when he would sit in the chair, when the barber would drape the cape across his chest. The trap was set. The plan was in motion. And Albert Anastasia, who had outlived gang wars, courtroom battles, and countless assassination attempts, was walking straight into the last act of his story. Somewhere, perhaps in his quiet Staten Island home, Carlo Gambino sat with the knowledge of what was about to happen. If he felt any hesitation, any flicker of doubt, he did not show it. Carlo was a man who believed in patience, in inevitability. And now, the inevitable had arrived. Albert's fate was sealed. The betrayal was complete. The commission had given its silent nod, the killers had their orders, and New York's most feared gangster was about to meet the same end he had delivered to so many others. The stage was set for one of the most infamous assassinations in Mafia history, one that would shock the underworld and the public alike. The morning of October 25, 1957, was ordinary enough, which is what makes the events that followed feel almost surreal. The Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan buzzed with the usual weekday energy, businessmen in crisp suits passed through the lobby, bellhops carried luggage, and the city outside pulsed with traffic and noise. Inside the ground-floor barbershop, the air smelled faintly of talcum powder and shaving cream, that clean, soothing scent that usually put men at ease. Albert Anastasia arrived shortly after 10 a.m. He had been here many times before. This was one of the few places where he allowed himself to relax, where he believed he was safe. He left his usual bodyguard waiting outside, an unusual but telling decision. Perhaps he wanted privacy, perhaps he felt untouchable. He took his place in the chair, and the barber draped the white cape over him, tucking it gently under his chin. The sound of scissors and clippers filled the small shop, blending with the faint hum of the city outside. Imagine the scene, a calm, quiet morning, Albert sitting almost regally in the chair, the barber focused on his work. In the mirror, Albert could see his own reflection, the strong face, the dark, serious eyes, the man who had survived so much to sit here now. If he was thinking of anything, perhaps it was business, perhaps it was his family, perhaps nothing at all. The moment was deceptively peaceful. Then the door opened. Two men entered, their faces partially hidden by scarves or handkerchiefs. In an instant, the tranquility of the barbershop shattered. The men pulled pistols, and before Albert could react, the room exploded with noise. Bullets tore through the air, the deafening cracks echoing off the tile and mirrors. Albert's body jerked violently as shot after shot struck him. The barber, frozen in shock, ducked for cover, the clippers falling silent on the floor. Albert tried to stand, tried to turn toward his attackers, but the cape tangled around him. Disoriented, bleeding, he stumbled forward, clawing at the air, as if trying to grab hold of something that wasn't there. Some say he lunged at the mirror, shattering it as he fell, others that he collapsed toward the chair, his hand outstretched as though reaching for a gun he never had time to draw. The entire attack lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, one of the most feared men in the history of organized crime was cut down. The gunman fled quickly, leaving behind only smoke, shell casings, and the lifeless body of Albert Anastasia. The barbershop was suddenly quiet again, eerily so, the kind of silence that follows a thunderclap. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that history had just been made inside that small room. Word spread quickly. By the time the police arrived, reporters were already gathering, photographers pressing their faces to the windows, eager to capture the scene. The image of Albert's body, sprawled on the barbershop floor, the once pristine cape now soaked with blood, became one of the most iconic crime photos of the century. It was a shocking sight, the execution of a man who had once seemed invincible, brought low in such an ordinary, almost intimate setting. The hit sent shockwaves through the underworld. This was not just the killing of a boss, it was a message. The commission had sanctioned the murder of one of its own, and in doing so, had declared that no man, no matter how feared, was beyond their reach. For some, it was a relief, a chance to turn the page on a boss whose temper had threatened to drag them all into unnecessary war. For others, it was a warning that chilled them to the bone. To the public, the assassination seemed like something out of a gangster movie, almost too dramatic to be real. The newspapers ran headlines in bold print: Anastasia slain in barbershop chair, execution of Mad Hatter stuns New York. Television and radio carried the story across the country, and for days afterward, people talked about it in hushed tones. The idea that a man could be murdered in such a public place, in the middle of Manhattan, in broad daylight, was both terrifying and fascinating. For Carlo Gambino, the quiet underboss who had planned the coup with Vito Genovese, it was the culmination of years of patience. Gambino did not celebrate openly, that was not his style. But he now stood as the de facto head of the family, the man who would inherit Albert's empire and reshape it according to his own vision. The barbershop itself became a kind of morbid landmark, a place people would point out as the spot where Anastasia was killed. For those who had known him, it was a strange place for such a man to die, not on the street, not in a back room, but in a chair, draped in a barber's cape, unarmed and unsuspecting. There is a haunting quality to this scene even now, decades later. The image of Albert, a man who had sent so many others to their deaths, meeting his own in such a vulnerable position, has a grim symmetry. It was as though the violence he had once commanded had finally caught up with him, right there in that small, tiled room. As the police wheeled his body out past the crowd, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the crowd pressed closer. But there were no answers, not yet. The killers had vanished into the city, leaving behind only speculation. That night, the underworld went quiet. Meetings were called, allegiances were reaffirmed, and the power structure shifted. The family that had once borne the Mangano name, then the Anastasia name, would soon bear another name entirely, Gambino. But for a moment, all that mattered was the barbershop. The chair was empty now, the mirrors cracked, the floor stained. The hum of the clippers was silent. And in that silence, the reign of Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter, the Lord High Executioner, came to an end. The news of Albert Anastasia's assassination spread across New York City like wildfire. Within hours, radio broadcasts were describing the murder in vivid detail: the barbershop, the white cape soaked with blood, the masked gunmen who vanished as quickly as they appeared. Newspapers rushed out special editions, their front pages screaming with headlines about the execution of one of the most feared men in America. The public, both horrified and fascinated, devoured every word. For many, the story seemed almost cinematic, a gangster gunned down in Midtown Manhattan, as if straight out of a crime drama. But within the underworld, the reaction was very different. The murder sent a chill through the mafia's highest ranks. Even for men who lived with violence, this killing was significant. Albert Anastasia had not been a renegade soldier or a troublesome lieutenant, he had been a boss, one of the most powerful in New York, and his death had been sanctioned. That was what made it so shocking. This was not a rogue hit. This was the commission reasserting its authority, reminding every man in the room that no one, not even the Lord High Executioner, was above the rules. For Albert's loyalists, the message was devastating. Men who had served under him for years, who had prospered under his rule, now faced an uncertain future. Some grieved quietly, others panicked, wondering if they would be the next targets. The docks were tense in the days following the killing. Longshoremen worked in near silence, glancing over their shoulders, unsure what would come next. Law enforcement descended quickly on the scene, but as was often the case with mob killings, there were no arrests. The gunman had disappeared, leaving behind no witnesses willing to cooperate. Detectives questioned the barbershop employees, but they had little to offer. The attack had been over in seconds, too fast to process. Rumors flew about who had ordered the hit. Some suspected Vito Genovese, others whispered about Carlo Gambino. The newspapers speculated endlessly, but no solid evidence ever emerged. And then, almost as if by magic, the transition of power began, smooth, quiet, almost bloodless. Carlo Gambino, the ever-patient underboss, stepped forward to take control of the family. There was no open challenge. The soldiers, sensing the way the wind was blowing, pledged their loyalty to Gambino. He was calm, measured, and respectful in how he handled the shift, careful not to provoke unnecessary resentment among those who had been close to Albert. It was a brilliant move. By consolidating power quickly but without brutality, Gambino reassured the family that there would be no chaos, no endless cycle of revenge killings. He positioned himself not as a usurper but as a stabilizing force, the man who would guide the family through a turbulent time. This approach worked. Within weeks, the Anastasia family had been transformed into the Gambino family, a name that would soon become one of the most powerful in Mafia history. The commission quietly ratified the change. There were no objections. Even those who had admired Albert's strength recognized that his unpredictability had become a liability. With Gambino in charge, they believed the family would be more stable, more discreet, and less likely to draw unwanted attention. For the city, Albert's death felt like the end of an era. The newspapers ran stories reflecting on his violent career, describing him as both ruthless and strangely charismatic. Editorials debated whether his murder marked a victory for law and order or merely a changing of the guard within the underworld. Some citizens felt safer knowing that a man as dangerous as Anastasia was gone. Others feared that his death might spark a new wave of gangland violence. But violence never came, at least, not in the way many expected. Gambino's takeover was remarkably peaceful. He believed in business over bloodshed, in profit over headlines. Under his leadership, the family shifted toward a quieter, more calculating style of operation. Gambino rarely raised his voice, rarely drew attention to himself. In stark contrast to Albert's fiery temperament, Carlo preferred to work from the shadows, slowly tightening his grip until his power was absolute. Albert's murder also rippled beyond New York. Across the country, other crime families took note. The commission had shown that even a boss could be removed if he endangered the larger organization. This realization kept many men in line, reminding them that power was conditional, dependent on staying within the rules. Yet for all its orderliness, there was still something unsettling about the way Albert's life had ended. Those who had known him well spoke of the strangeness of seeing such a powerful man cut down in such a vulnerable moment. The image of him stumbling from the barber chair, cape tangled around him, stayed in their minds. It was a reminder that in their world, no one was ever truly safe. On the waterfront, Albert's name still carried weight for a while. Some longshoremen spoke of him with reverence, remembering the Christmas envelopes he handed out, the way he had protected their jobs. Others whispered about his rages, the men who disappeared under his orders, the fear that had hung over the piers. Slowly, his influence faded, replaced by Gambino's quieter but no less effective rule. In the weeks after the assassination, the barbershop was cleaned, repaired, reopened. Life went on, as it always does, even after a shock as great as this one. But for those who passed by, it was hard not to glance through the window and imagine the scene, to picture the moment when the guns went off and Albert Anastasia's reign came to its bloody end. For Carlo Gambino, the aftermath was the beginning of something new. He had removed his rival without plunging the family into chaos, and now he had the opportunity to build something lasting. His reign would be quieter, less theatrical, but no less powerful, and in many ways, more dangerous. Under his leadership, the family would grow into the largest and most influential of the 5 families, its reach extending far beyond the docks Albert had once ruled. Albert's death had closed one chapter of Mafia history, but it had opened another. The era of the Mad Hatter was over. The era of the calculating Don had begun. When the gun smoke cleared and Albert Anastasia's body was laid to rest, his legend only seemed to grow. In life, he had been feared; in death, he became something closer to myth, a figure both terrifying and strangely captivating. The newspapers could not get enough of him. Writers called him, the Lord High Executioner, the Mad Hatter, the man who lived by the sword and died by it. Each retelling added another layer, blurring the line between the man he truly was and the character he had become in the public imagination. Part of what made Albert's story so fascinating was its contradictions. Here was a man who had risen from the poverty of Calabria to sit at the very top of one of New York's 5 families, a man who could be charming, generous, even paternal to those he liked, yet also capable of extraordinary violence. Friends spoke of his kindness, how he quietly helped struggling families, how he made sure the widows of fallen soldiers were looked after. Enemies, on the other hand, told stories of his temper, of the times he personally beat men bloody for disobedience, of the icy look in his eyes when he ordered a killing. Hollywood, inevitably, became fascinated with him. The image of a gangster sitting in a barber's chair, gunned down in mid-shave, became one of the most iconic moments in mob lore. It inspired scenes in films and television shows for decades. Some say that the famous barbershop shooting in The Godfather, when Michael Corleone assassinates Sollozzo and Captain McCluskey, was partly inspired by the idea of sudden, shocking violence in a quiet, ordinary setting. Others point to Albert's life as a template for characters like Tony Soprano, a man torn between being a loving family man and a ruthless mob boss. But with myth came exaggeration. Over the years, Albert's body count was inflated by writers and storytellers eager to make him into a near-mythical figure. Some accounts claim he personally killed dozens, even hundreds of men with his own hands. The truth is probably less dramatic. While Albert undoubtedly committed murders in his early days, likely as part of Murder Incorporated, by the time he was boss, he rarely carried out hits personally. His power came not from the gun in his own hand but from his ability to order others to act. The nickname, Lord High Executioner, fed into this mythology, conjuring images of a man ruling over a court of death, deciding who would live and who would die. In reality, Albert was not some gleeful sadist reveling in violence. Those who knew him said he saw killings as business, as a necessary evil to maintain control and keep order in a world where weakness could be fatal. Violence was, to him, a tool, sometimes brutal, yes, but not gratuitous. Even his famous temper may have been exaggerated in memory. Albert was indeed known for sudden outbursts, but some who were closest to him claimed that these rages were calculated, a way to scare those around him into obedience. Others insist they were genuine, unpredictable flashes of anger that made him dangerous even to his own men. The truth, as with so much about Albert, is likely somewhere in between. There is also the question of his downfall. The newspapers painted it as the ultimate betrayal, a Shakespearean tragedy in which the loyal underboss Carlo Gambino orchestrated his boss's murder to seize power. But historians have pointed out that Albert's assassination was not simply the result of personal ambition. It was a collective decision by the Mafia Commission, one made because Albert's behavior had become a risk to the entire organization. Gambino may have been the main beneficiary, but he was not the sole architect. Looking back, one can see how Albert became both a cautionary tale and a symbol of an era. To the Mafia, he represented what could happen when a boss let his temper rule him, when he drew too much attention, when he made decisions without the Commission's approval, when he forgot that the organization came before the individual. To the public, he became the face of gangster glamour, the embodiment of the dangerous allure of the mob, powerful, feared, but ultimately doomed. The barbershop itself became a kind of shrine, a place where people whispered about the murder as if it were a ghost story. Tourists and locals alike would pass by the Park Sheraton Hotel and talk about the day the Mad Hatter was gunned down. Writers and journalists returned to the story again and again, each time adding a little more drama, a little more mystique. In many ways, Albert Anastasia's myth eclipsed the man. The real Albert was complex, a survivor, a family man, a labor racketeer, a killer, a man who could be loyal and brutal in equal measure. The mythic Albert, the one who lives on in books and films, is larger than life, the executioner whose name struck fear into an entire city, the man who died with a barber's cape around his neck, his last moments as dramatic as any Hollywood screenplay. Even decades later, his name still carries weight. Mafia historians speak of him with a mixture of awe and dread. Some admire his boldness, his refusal to back down. Others see him as a man doomed by his own flaws, a man who could not temper his fury, who could not adapt to the quieter, more calculated era the Mafia was entering. In the end, Albert Anastasia became both legend and lesson. He showed what it meant to rise from nothing to become a king of the underworld, and what it meant to fall from that throne when the world you ruled decided you had become too dangerous to live. The barbershop is quiet now. The clippers are no longer buzzing, the mirrors are clean, the floors polished. To any passerby, it is just another place to get a haircut, just another corner of Midtown Manhattan. But for those who know the story, it is impossible to look at that room and not think of what happened there on that October morning in 1957, the day Albert Anastasia's life ended and his legend truly began. It is strange how quickly a man's power can vanish. For years, Albert had seemed untouchable. He had survived the electric chair, outlasted gang wars, defeated his rivals, and faced down the justice system time and again. He had been the Lord High Executioner, the man who decided life and death for others, the man who kept order in a violent world. And yet, in the end, he died like any other man, suddenly, violently, with no time to fight back. That is the paradox of Albert Anastasia's life. He lived by the rules of the Mafia, and those same rules sealed his fate. The Commission had given him his power, and the Commission had taken it away. In the world he helped build, no one was above the law, not even him. When you think of Albert's final moments, there is something almost poetic about them. The barber chair is a place of trust, a place where you let yourself be vulnerable, closing your eyes as someone works so close to your throat with a blade. It is a ritual of calm and routine, and yet, for Albert, it became the setting for one of the most violent moments in Mafia history. There is an image that lingers, Albert half-rising from the chair, tangled in the white cape, reaching out as though he could stop the bullets with his bare hands. It is an image of power undone, of destiny catching up to a man who had eluded it for so long. But his story is not only one of death. It is also one of survival, ambition, and transformation. Albert came from nothing, a boy from Calabria who arrived in America with little more than determination, and climbed higher than almost anyone could imagine. He built an empire on the docks, co-founded the most feared enforcement arm in Mafia history, and sat at the table with the most powerful gangsters of his time. He was both feared and respected, both admired and hated. For those who lived through his reign, Albert's name carried weight. Even long after his death, men on the waterfront still told stories about him, how he kept order, how he punished betrayal, how he rewarded loyalty. Some remembered him as a tyrant, others as a protector. Perhaps he was both, and perhaps that is what made him such a compelling figure. In the decades since, Albert's life has become the stuff of books, documentaries, and endless retellings. Each generation rediscovers him in some way: the boy who escaped the electric chair, the killer who commanded murder incorporated, the boss who met his fate in a barber's chair. There is a reason his story endures: it is dramatic, tragic, and deeply human. In many ways, Albert's story is also the story of the American Mafia itself. His rise mirrors the rise of organized crime in America, from the rough-and-tumble gang wars of the Prohibition era to the sleek, corporate-style syndicate of the post-war years. And his fall mirrors the dangers that always haunted the men at the top. Power in the Mafia was never permanent, never safe. One wrong move, one breach of trust, and the throne could be pulled out from under you. As you reflect on Albert's life, you might picture him walking the piers of Brooklyn late at night, the air heavy with the smell of the sea, the city lights glinting on the black water. You might picture him sitting in a smoky backroom, listening as his lieutenants reported on the week's business. Or you might picture him in those final moments, in the chair, unaware that the world he had built was about to end in a hail of bullets. And then, imagine the barbershop after it was all over. The mirrors shattered, the cape soaked with blood, the chair still spinning slightly from the force of his fall. The silence after the gunman fled must have been deafening, broken only by the sound of the barber's panicked breathing. In that stillness, Albert Anastasia's reign ended, not with a courtroom sentence, not with a slow decline, but with the sudden finality that had defined his own approach to justice. The barbershop is empty now, but the echoes remain. Every story told about Albert, every headline, every whispered legend keeps that chair from ever truly being vacant. It sits there in memory, waiting, as though the man who once occupied it might rise again, adjust his cufflinks, and walk back out into the city he once ruled. And so, his legacy is both a warning and a fascination. He reminds us that even the most powerful are vulnerable, that even the most feared men cannot escape their own fate. His life shows the cost of living by the sword, and his death shows the inevitability of falling by it. As the story comes to an end, you can let your thoughts drift back to that quiet barbershop, to the hum of clippers, to the white cape, to the last moment of calm before the gunfire. The city moves on, the world moves on, but in the imagination, that scene is frozen forever, a reminder of a man who lived without fear until the very moment he could no longer run from it. Close your eyes and picture the chair one last time. Empty now. Silent. The storm has passed. The Mad Hatter is gone. And with that final thought, the story of Albert Anastasia settles into history, a tale of power, blood, and destiny, a story to carry you into the quiet of the night.